Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for coming and joining us for our Time as a Weapon session. If you weren't there yesterday, my name's Tim Grayson. I'm the director of DARPA STO. And the whole theme of this session, the purpose of this session, is to build out a little bit more both the motivation as well as some of the ideas and challenges behind this idea of time as a weapon, which is central to what we're trying to do within STO and frankly across a lot of DARPA in terms of these distributed capabilities, adaptive capabilities, operating at speed. So we want to motivate what that means in a little more detail and why we care so much about it, and then hopefully start posing more challenges to you in the audience to think about solutions for the future. And in that regard, before we really dive in, just want to remind people about their app, and please feel free as we go through to be shooting in your questions, and we'll try to address as many as we can at the end of this session. So again, to recap yesterday, we highlighted the importance in the motivation for this whole mosaic warfare theme as being, yes, we want to be distributed, yes, we want to have disaggregation, but we need to do it fast. I highlighted yesterday the whole concept of continuous speed. That idea of not just moving fast once, but being able to constantly adapt to whatever the possible situation was. The other thing that I highlighted yesterday was this notion that continuous speed is not just a mission executing the fight type of challenge. Many times, whenever someone puts up one of the distributed system of systems kind of architecture pictures, even when they provide some analysis or some analytic framework for what's the payoff, it usually is starting right at the moment of pulling the trigger. What did I get in terms of some exchange ratio or increased probability of kill or something of that nature because I had this distributed architecture? And it never really addresses the problem of, and how did all those pieces get there? So one of the big themes we want to develop today is this notion that speed, time, continuous adaptation applies at all time scales. Okay? So I'm happy to have a group of very distinguished and accomplished panelists here with us today. A little bit about their background and how they fit into this notion of time as a weapon and continuous adaptation at these different operational time scales. And so as I'll introduce them all now, but sort of going in order of time. First up, we're going to have retired Marine Corps Lieutenant Colonel Dan Schmidt, and who's going to be talking to us about continuous speed, time as a weapon at the operational mission execution timeline. Dan has almost 30 years of service in the Marine Corps, where he had a reputation, I guess, with many combat operations that were known for getting in and messing with the bad guys' OODA loop, winning that initiative, winning the fight through that notion of time as a weapon. In his last assignment, which relates highly to a lot of these concepts and the notion of lethality, he was part of he was the Marine Corps rep, I guess, to the OSD, to the Secretary's task force for close combat lethality. And in his current role, he is, director of the Adaptive Threat Force Warfighting Lab, I guess. Marine Corps Warfighting. And he'll tell you more about that as we go along. So again, Dan will be that mission execution speed. Now, all time scales. It's one thing to say we can shoot faster, we can maneuver faster, we can get inside that execution time faster. But what happens if the bad guy goes and changes the plan? We're out executing one plan, and he decides not to even play that game. That's where we get into continuous speed at the operational planning timeline. And to address that topic, we're going to have Brigadier General Chance Saltzman. He has a strong background in the whole notion of command and control in general. Currently, he's helping to define the Air Force's vision and strategy for that as the Director of Current Operations in the Air Force A3 at Air Force Headquarters. But really highly relevant to our topic today, he led the multi-domain C2 ECCT, which I forget what ECCT stands for, but it's a crossed Air Force all enterprise type of study of what to go do next, which really has defined and set the vision, at least from an Air Force vantage, of a lot of what we were talking about over the past 2 days of distributed, joint, multi-domain kinds of fights. And how the heck do you actually go through and figure out how to position and apportion and task and execute all these forces in these extremely complex kinds of architectures and environments. And he's had to live a lot of this prior to that and has a lot of experience and probably a few battle scars working things that really are at the heart of multi-domain C2, coming at it from a space vantage point. Let's see, you were Chief of Strategy, I think, at the Joint Space Operations Center, as well as other things in the Space Command and Control domain. And then finally, one of the things that, frankly, for our department is probably one of the biggest challenges that we face is how do we actually build and field our systems faster? How do we win the fight for continuous speed at the acquisition and the development timeline? We can be down a path where we think we've got the biggest and best system going, planned for what we think is going to be the threat. But if we're doing that on timescales that are decadal, how do we really know what that threat or what that mission need is going to be 10, 20, 30 years from now? But that's where we are with a lot of our acquisition process at present. So to give us some perspective on other ways to think about transitioning, deploying, scaling new technology at really blazing speeds is Tom Lash. And Tom is coming to us as a senior leader within Amazon Web Services. And as I think a lot of you know, Amazon has a reputation in general of how being able to deploy new technology and frankly control very complex operations at incredibly fast speed. And as part of Amazon Web Services, I don't know what the statistics are up to now, but hey, you want 1,000 new nodes? Sure, we'll get it out there and figure out how to balance everything in a snap of the fingers. So Tom is going to be providing us that kind of perspective of how the commercial world thinks of deploying new technology at a competition-winning speed. And he's bringing more than just cloud insight into that, because he also has a background from this industry base with also many years as a senior leader at SAIC and then I believe Leidos after the Leidos transition before moving to Amazon Web Services. So he definitely does understand the DoD problems as well and hopefully can provide that type of context. So at any rate, with that, keeping fast and time as a weapon, over to Dan to talk about the operational execution timeline.
Thanks, Dr. Grayson. Dan Schmidt from the Marine Corps Warfighting Lab. Happy to be here, and I'm going to specifically speak about time as it relates to our small unit formations at the low tactical end. And I'm happy to stay in that arena because that's where I'm seeing and we're seeing significant differences and opportunities to capitalize. My last few years of duty were running live force experiments for the Marine Corps Warfighting Lab, set deep in the future against emerging capabilities of peer threats. And from there, I was exposed to the early days of mosaic warfare concept, and I was struggling in wrapping my head around what this means, what may be different about it, and it started gelling pretty quickly through my experience and live force experimentation. And then I add to it DARPA programs that I was exposed to, such as Offset or Improv, Proteus, if you're familiar with those. We start seeing the same concepts being applied at the low tactical level. So in contact with the enemy at the low tactical level, time is not as linear as we think about it. I had the privilege to spend a lot of my career interviewing and talking to adversaries and their perceptions of how Americans view the battlefield in general. Keeping in mind that our framework is that war, our definition of war and conflict is a violent clash of two or more independent wills, human wills, and that we can't take the human and the emotive out of the battlefield, whatever level we're talking about. It's most pronounced at the low tactical level where soldiers and Marines and airmen, sailors are at close contact with the enemy. And so thinking of time as we, in our culture, typically do as linear and steady state pace is not the way it plays out on the battlefield. It's, as we say, an area and a point target. And point target is there are moments in time that can be critical. And area target, we often think in terms of OODA loop. When you ask our theorists at the low tactical level, we always talk about OODA loop. But the truth is, the first O in OODA loop, observe, orient, decide, and act, observe is where we take the bulk of our casualties. 80% of our casualties in our close combat formations, our small tactical units, happen in that first O. And that's where we first started seeing the equities of the mosaic concept, where we can start taking non-traditional assets in a combined arms fashion, nested completely with our culture, quicker than our enemy, and gain improvements where we take our first hits on the chin historically. So that first O, we oftentimes don't get past that first O in observing our enemy before we're taking on the second O. Our adversaries tell us clearly that once we get past that observation and we begin to orient, we as a military force at the low tactical level drive the pace. And we essentially control time because of all the tools that are available to us. And our modern history is replete with examples of that with our small units. We can hear it from our adversaries saying, don't fight a squad with a squad. We'll do everything asymmetrically around the edges of that squad. But once that squad orients on our adversary, they drive the timeline because of the combined armed tools that are available to us. So we turn our scope and listen to our young Marines and soldiers, and what they tell us is they say, your combined arms doctrine that you grew up with is sound, but you focused on the tools. Typically, our combined arms doctrine, in its most basic analogy, might be like Charlie Sheen in the movie Platoon, where he's pinned down behind an anthill and an enemy's in a fighting hole, and he has a choice to create a dilemma for the enemy. If the enemy pops his head up, Mr. Sheen can shoot him with direct fire rifle. If the enemy ducks to avoid that, Mr. Sheen has a hand grenade that he can indirect. He creates a dilemma for the enemy. Expand that across the force through our small units. We're constantly creating to use lethal weapons to create dilemmas for our enemy. And we focused during the past 50 years, really since our World War II experience, on building those combined arms capabilities in our small unit levels. What we found now is the tools we reach into for combined arms, every time we reach in to grab a tool, the toolbox has changed, and there are more varying tools out there. And really, to address the way we look at time in close combat formations, we have to think about our culture in particular. Our culture and the way we teach time, talk about time, and exploit time on the battlefield in our small units, there's some dissonance today. And the mosaic concept really tries to get after that dissonance. I'll give some examples. If a small unit leader tells his soldiers to be in a specific place at a specific time with the specific tools to do his job, if that soldier is late, that's far more noticeable in our culture than if he shows up with the wrong tools. In many other cultures, it's not the time that's the priority, it's the right tools. And this constant interplay between the right tools at the right place and time, or simply time as the driving factor, is really in quite a flux right now because of the changing tools. So we want to go back and recognize that if this is a human endeavor, and we have these very rapid advancement in technologies, and if we can reduce the cognitive load that's on our small unit soldiers and Marines, we have to draw a fence, but it's not a very straight fence. It's a mesh fence between where we reduce the cognitive load, but keep all of the moral and human factors on top of the soldier and Marine. So an analogy might be, not too long ago, all of our cars had manual transmission. Technology allowed us to make automatic transmissions, and that was a no-brainer. It was more efficient and took some of the work off of the operator. But the technology wasn't there that it could choose what radio station the operator wanted to listen to. And that mood and that emotion, we don't want to separate because that is the principal driving factor of the human nature of combat at the low tactical level. So being very disciplined about where we can leverage the technology, machine learning and AI, to reduce the cognitive demands on the close combat leader and exploit his human nature and emotion. Because I believe we're stumbling upon an offset, a significant offset within our force. Recently, we did an experiment in the Marine Corps Warfighting Lab where we took newly cultured Marines, hundreds of newly cultured Marines, and we gave them access to common commercial off-the-shelf technology, and we asked them in an austere and human-driven competitive environment to make combinations as quickly as they could to create dilemmas for their enemy. These Marines were able to do it very quickly and very effectively and constantly change the tools because the culture they grew up with. In fact, they were able to do it faster than that same adaptation that we were watching in our adversaries operating around the world. In fact, it was predictive in nature. It was well ahead of our enemies. We attribute that to that our soldiers and Marines are growing up in democratic institutions. They're products of at least a high school education, a solid education foundation, and they were enabled to be creative with their combinations to make dilemmas. So we think that the native intellect of our soldiers and Marines is potentially an offset. So investigating this further in the barracks, I start trying to understand why we have this tremendous capability in our young soldiers and Marines coming up, but we're not fully exploiting it. And the young Marines will frankly tell me when you enable them and empower them, they'll say, "Sir, we go back to your Cold War methods to honor the tradition and service of our military past, but we're already federated. And we already understand how to trust and when to mistrust information coming through technology. And we live in a generation where we can look at the face of the phone and we don't need to know what happens behind it. And so we'll continue to honor your legacy, but start listening to ours." And that's when I realized exploiting that native intellect that's joining our ranks, that's potentially an offset that exists at the low tactical level, and they're doing it every day. We have examples of Marines putting together very quick combined arms offensives against creative and enabled enemies by using money and information and culture and, of course, the traditional combined arms weapons to generate tempo against the enemy so they can use that time as a linear product and a point target at the decisive place. So my point, and I was going to go into some slides talking about one of the best things we can do to enable this at the low tactical level that give the Marines and soldiers the ability to manipulate time as a weapon is simply translated to mobility. And where we see decisions to increase their mobility, that gives them the ability to speed up and slow down as appropriate as they're combining these creative tools that are constantly changing. History is also full of examples where our mobility and our time increases have come from the bottom up, the low tactical level up, and have been institutionalized. So focusing our sights on the low tactical level, and also looking at our mobility solutions with respect to our adversaries' mobility solutions as it applies to time. I look forward to your questions as they apply to the low tactical level, and I'll pass it on to General Saltzman now.
Thanks, Dan. Well, I'm going to have to ask you to kind of come up out of the mud a little bit and talk at the operational level. I appreciate everything Dan said, and I think we constantly have to remind ourselves, especially if you work like I do in the Pentagon, that there's still soldiers, sailors, airmen, Marines out there getting dirty every day trying to close with the enemy and beat them. So with that as a backdrop, my talk is more about at the operational level. And so at the operational level, we have to keep in mind that we have to develop the plans, secure the resources, and direct forces in such a way that our tactical forces can maintain an advantage against the adversary. So a lot of what I think Dan is talking about isn't possible if you screw things up royally at the operational level. That's shorthand. So that's been our focus with General Goldfein's initiative to address multi-domain command and control. And so for us, multi-domain, primarily from the Air Force, we think airspace and cyber. But if you've been to our Air Operations Center, you'll notice that it's an all-domain kind of command and control node. We have LNOs and the Battlefield Coordination Detachment to make sure that we're prosecuting targets and conducting the air and space campaign in such a way that we meet all the JFC's objectives. And so that's kind of been our focus, is that operational level, the Air Operations Center, and what we can provide to the Joint Force in terms of leveraging the capabilities that all the domains offer. But it doesn't take long to think about the new warfighting domains of space and cyber to say we might be dealing with a slightly different animal here. You know, what does close contact look like in cyberspace? What does it look like as you start to contest the space domain? The principles of war, I think, still hold up, but it is fundamentally different in several aspects. And time and distance is certainly a couple of those key instances or key elements that have to be addressed when we start talking about adding space and cyber as joint warfighting domains. The other thing we had to focus on is command and control. And depending on where you are, what service you're in, what you do for a living, command and control has slightly different meanings. And so we just right out of the gate, we wanted to be clear because I think the consistent thread as you look across all of our cultures, command and control is really going back to this idea of the OODA loop, observe, orient, decide, and act. It has something to do with gaining situational awareness, understanding the environment that you're in, being able to make operational decisions contextually around that information. And then from a command and control standpoint, you have to be able to direct forces to do something about it, and that's that act piece. We also added one more function to those three: situational awareness, decision-making, and force direction. And we added battle management because we think that in the face of an adversary, conditions change so fast that you really need to describe situational awareness, decision-making, and force direction slightly differently when you're in contact with an adversary, a thinking adversary that's trying to deny those, and we call that battle management. So with those four things and thinking about all the domains that we need to bring to bear, that's multi-domain command and control. And if you haven't thought too much about it, and I've had the pleasure and pain of thinking about this for the last at least 23 months, and you can take this into a number of different places, but we started to categorize the challenges around operational concepts, and I'll talk about those, the technology that's needed to do this properly, and then just the basic training, education, and some of the other supporting structures for doing command and control in new and different ways. And so from an operational concept standpoint, consider this. And I'll talk from an Air Force perspective, but I bet you can think of examples in all the services. You know, we provide our space forces primarily to U.S. STRATCOM, and by the end of the year to U.S. Space Command. We provide our cyber forces to U.S. Cybercom, and we provide our air forces usually to a geographic combatant commander, a joint force commander, through an air component to the geographic AOR. And then we just expect that they'll magically come back together in some magical joint plan and integrate seamlessly and synergistically to create combined effects on an adversary. And that's a great theory, but in practice, that's very complicated. The very least of which means you have to manage across about 15 different time zones, 3 different very senior commanders' battle rhythms, targeting cycles, planning cycles. You don't share the same data in all of the connected ops centers. You don't have what I would call classic unity of command, even as you start to prioritize the resources across those different capabilities. And so just structurally, we are not set up to really get the most out of multi-domain operations. And if you can't get it right in collecting information about your situational environment, situational awareness about your environment, and you can't build a plan that has integrated multi-domain effects, the chances of it being executed effectively as multi-domain operations, I would contend, is almost zero. And so those operational concepts that we have to tease out, mature, and become better at is one line of approach that we're pursuing pretty heavily. The second one, which won't surprise this audience at all, is that if we're going to really compress the OODA loop at the operational level, we're going to have to rely differently on technology. Technology that accesses the vast amounts of data that we have, but puts it into an operational context without human intervention. We don't have enough analysts to go through all of the information that we can collect on an operationally relevant timeline. We're going to need machines to help us do that. Likewise, as you get to the decision-making process, I believe that we need to better leverage technology to help our decision makers. Almost every industry has some level of decision support software, decision support tools, and the military does as well, but not enough to really compress the information into operationally relevant decisions the way it needs to. And then lastly, we have to recognize that we have to be able to direct forces in all of the environments, all of the domains when they are contested. They are trying to shut down our data links. They're trying to interfere with our bandwidth. The push-to-talks are not going to work. The data transfers from AOCs to the wings are not going to be there when we need them. And so how do we build a resilient architecture that can fight through that and be more mosaic so that any one piece that's removed, you can still see the picture, you can still get the mission done through alternate resiliency kinds of paths. And then the last thing I'll mention as far as MDC2 goes is training and expertise. I come from a service, we love our badges. We love what's above U.S. Air Force, and we sum each other up by taking a look at our badges and say, you're a pilot, you're a space guy, you're a cyber operator. And that's not even enough for us. Then we put stars on top of them and wreaths around those. So we say, you're an old space operator. You're wise beyond your years with regards to that. We love the tribal mentality of our accessions AFSC. And that gives us tremendous depth in our weapon system knowledge and our tactical understanding of what needs to happen. But by the time you've been in 12 to 15 years, that's pretty much all you know. The idea that you could grab a space operator and say, explain to me how a seed package works, it's not a part of our culture. So when I say multi-domain planners, we don't train them, we don't educate them. If we have any, and there are some out there, it's by luck of the draw that they happen to have some assignments that put them in a position to pick some things up along the way. And so one of the things that we know we have to do is figure out how to preserve our tactical expertise, but give opportunities to establish that operational breadth across all of our domains of operation. And so we're working hard to figure out just how to strike that balance and get it right. So this is a complicated endeavor, but that technology piece, I think for this crowd, I would reemphasize is essential. It's foundational. The ability to leverage cloud structures for our data so that we can deploy algorithms rather than shipping data all over the world to a fusion engine and an analyst somewhere. This is a cost-prohibitive strategy at best. And so how do we take advantage of what I believe industry's already kind of figured out? And those of you that have worked in this AOR long enough know that the way we acquire systems and our processes is more about oversight, requirements development, not necessarily about agile acquisition on an operationally relevant timeline. And so we're going to have to work hard to kind of right that ship, particularly where software-defined capability is necessary. And so with that as a kind of a lead-in, and I'm looking forward to your questions, let me pass it off to Mr. Lash.
Great, thank you, sir. So the general brought us up out of the muck. For my speech, you're happy to put on your hoodies and your t-shirts and your flip-flops because we're going to talk commercial tech here for a few minutes. Since coming to Amazon, I've learned an awful lot about speed and time. Amazon is a very time-dominant culture. And I've thought about this a lot since we've talked about doing this presentation, and I think some of the essential elements as to why Amazon is so time-focused really get down to our leadership principles. We have 14 leadership principles. I strongly encourage everyone to Google those at a break and check them out. Number 9 is one called bias for action. And I'd like to read to you what we mean by bias for action. Speed matters in business. Many decisions and actions are reversible and do not need extensive study. We value calculated risk-taking. So I'd like to focus on the second part of that and the idea of reversible decisions. And we call these internally two-way doors versus one-way doors. And if we can think about the decisions we need to make in terms of what are reversible and what are irreversible, and spend less time on the reversible decisions, we can really spend spend our mental energy on the ones that we can't undo, those one-way doors. And certainly in the national security community, we have a lot of one-way doors. We need to be cognizant of that. But there are an awful lot of two-way doors in our daily life. So we like to think about our reversible decisions and our irreversible decisions. We also combine that with another one of our leadership principles, which is be right a lot. So if you can combine having two-way doors with being right a lot, you can go really fast because you can take your decisions and figure out which ones that you can afford to be wrong on to some extent. So long as you're right on those, you're more than you're wrong. So that's one part of, I think, answering the earlier question, how do we go faster? I'd like to kind of highlight a couple of other elements of our culture. Any Amazon Prime members out of the audience? Statistically, probably 60% of you are Prime members. We have this thing called free shipping. We can get pretty much anything in the world to anywhere in the world in 48 hours or less. That is a real time driver, right? That kind of drives a lot of how we think about even our internal processes and our internal systems. So when we do interviews, guess what? We have to have our interview feedback within 24 to 48 hours because we like to get back to the candidate within 48 hours and tell them our decision. So if we can get anything in the world, anywhere in the world in 48 hours or less, then you can do your security training in 48 hours or less. You can do your performance reviews in 48 hours or less. There are all kinds of administrative things that a lot of people don't like to do, but because of that, that really drives a culture and a discipline that allows us to go fast across the enterprise. Now we're going on to Prime Now. If anybody uses Prime Now, we're in a Prime Now zone right here. You can order anything and have it delivered within 2 hours. So I'm kind of scared for what that does to our security training and interviews if we have 2-hour delivery now. Where I work, Amazon Web Services, in 2017, we had 1,430 new feature releases. Okay, that's not software releases. We did all kinds of maintenance releases on top of that. 1,430 feature releases. The last quarter of the year, we had over 500 feature releases. So when we compile the 2018 numbers, which will be well over 2,000 feature releases. So to Tim's earlier point, really is cultural how we're able to bring new things to market, new capabilities to market, new features to market to satisfy our customers. We're doing that at a pretty good clip. So that's kind of my first point, is that speed really is cultural, and depending on how you align your organization, align your culture and your values for your organization, that can help drive speed across the enterprise. The other thing I've learned about speed at Amazon is that speed and efficiency are closer to antonyms than synonyms. And what do I mean by that? Many organizations are organized for efficiency. They do more with less. There isn't a lot of slack in the system. Well, what that tends to do is not lend itself towards moving quickly because you don't have the resources to move quickly when you need to. So no one likes to be inefficient. You have to be efficient with the resources that we do have, but it is important to resource for speed. And if you value speed, and if that's part of your culture, then you will resource for speed, and you'll make sure that you have the necessary capacity to take on new projects or special opportunities whenever those arise. So the second thing I've learned about speed and time in Amazon is really to make sure that you're resourcing for speed. And the third and last thing is Amazon's a very long-term focused company. When we take a decision to our CEO, we don't talk about anything less than a 10-year investment cycle. So speed does not mean being short-sighted or short-term focused or going for the quick hit. And I think that may be where a lot of companies fall down, is they're looking for the quick hit. So I certainly encourage people not to associate going fast with thinking short-term. In fact, it's quite the opposite. You can set a long-term goal and a long-term strategy and get there as fast as you can because you want to get there, because it's exciting to get there, because it's impactful to get there. But that does not mean being short-sighted. Thank you.
Okay, thank you all, panel, for your comments. Let's thank them first. Okay, we have lots of interesting questions rolling in. Fortunately, we have a little bit of time left to go through these. That's good. So I want to start off with the 800-pound elephant in the room, however cliches I just mixed together. Acquisition. And the question here was just in general about, can acquisition support this notion of time as a weapon? But based upon all three of your comments, I want to hit on a specific issue. Dan and General Saltzman, you both talked a lot to the notion of needing technology to reduce that cognitive burden, to give us both speed and allow us to work with more complexity. And one of the things I've seen, particularly with C2 decision aid types of technology, it is fundamentally, it's always dangerous to say impossible, but it's really hard to disconnect a decision aid from specific mission needs. And yet, and at the same time, our acquisition process and our development process tends to say, hey, developing things, that's over for you S&T and acquisition guys. Go build me some tools, and then later on we'll think about buying them. And as a result, we seem to get decision aids that are defined looking 5, 10, 15 years out. And we hear about Amazon doing 2,000 new features in a year. Ideas about a lot here to digest, but acquisition, tech transition, and how that relates back to actual mission focus and bringing that time, both executing acquisition at time, but also then to give you time. Any one of you want to comment on that?
I could start, sir. As Mr. Lash said, you can't think about time without thinking about culture. And I admit I'm probably the Luddite in the room, the only non-prime member. And so I'm suspicious of technology. I can fix it within 2 hours. I'm suspicious of technology. I'm the guy that all the Afghans and the Iraqis said, you have all the watches, we have all the time. I may know the time, but they know how to use the time. And I really was struggling with that technology can be as dangerous as it can be helpful. But over time, and not a pun, I started realizing that we have some hurtful methods, hurtful for today in our military culture, such as the word end state, where we suppose time stops and that we have this rosy horizon that is an end state and an activity stop that causes us to think about time with a finite end. And we also have, our military decision-making process is time iterative, but the truth is we actually use Dr. Gary Klein's prime recognition decision-making model, where we recognize something and we put patterns together and we have solutions intuitively. That's where I started believing where technology can help us, because machine learning and AI can recognize things for us and can propose us solutions that then the human judgment falls on top of. And if that's where we're going, and that's where I see it going, I'm a big believer that I can't speak about the acquisitions process. I can't speak about acceleration of and proliferation of technology. I think just like the weather, it just is, and we have to adapt. But I want to focus more on measuring our speed of adaptation as a measure of effectiveness, not the efficiency as a measure of effectiveness. And that's what we see at the low tactical level.
Well, it's a great question. It's an important one. And so if any of this sounds flippant, I apologize. That is not my intent. But this is complicated, hard stuff. Our board of directors is 535 people across the river. Actually, it's on this side of the river, right? I forget where I am. North of here. And they have an important responsibility, and that's to make sure that you taxpayers, all of your money, hundreds of billions of dollars, is spent wisely in protection of you and defense of our national interests. I'm not trying to make light of that. That's a huge responsibility. And the system that they've put in place that does that is a very complicated acquisition process. And it starts with, they expect us to develop a concept of operations. What is it you think you need to do and why? And then we defend that. And then they say, well, okay, if we agree that that's what needs to be done, what are the systems that you need to do it? And then we debate that. And if you really know those systems, we need to see what the requirements are for each of those systems. And we will come up with the requirements necessary for each of those systems. And then those requirements will go out to industry. You guys know how programs of record are established, and what I've just described is 6 to 8 years. 6 to 8 years. And that's on a green light schedule with not a lot of consternation over the basic ConOps to requirements and program of record. And that's to make sure that we don't make a lot of mistakes with how we spend taxpayer money. The problem is that's an absurd timeline when we just heard about 48 hours and 2 hours. I mean, and the more you think about software-intensive systems and how we leverage information, a 6 to 8 year timeline, it just does not work. Now, here's the couple of things we have going for us, is Congress recognizes that. And our acquisition community recognizes that. And they're trying to find either different authorities, different processes, different ways to write these requirements. And they're experimenting with a lot of different contract vehicles, and you guys probably are aware of these as well. So I think on the positive side, this is like, hi, we're the US government, we have a problem with acquisition. That's the first step, right? And I think we're beyond the first step. And now we're to the point where we say, okay, well, what is the right way? What is the right balance where we can't just give you blank checks and say, go do what you want. It's not going to be that simple. So we have to meet them halfway. How do we develop rapidly ConOps and requirements that paint a picture? But here's my last point on this, because we got probably more good questions. But if I define the requirement and look at the systems and get to the requirements and build these programs of record, and I know that I have to think in the 2030, 2035 time frame, because that's realistically when those systems are going to be brought to bear. What happens if I get the ConOps wrong? I'm on a path. Once we develop the ConOps and start defining the systems and get those requirements on the books, there's not a lot of room to adjust without changing cost and schedule, which we all know is bad. So the problem I have with thinking about it along this kind of linear approach is I'm not sure exactly what I want in 2030 in terms of a ConOps. So I focus on more horizontal things. I try to think about what's the infrastructure that I can put in place that rapidly allows me to iterate on software fastest. And if I don't like it, I delete it and I download the next best piece of software and see if it works better. So thinking about the foundations and processes rather than a product that answers some defined set of requirements, I think is a different way of thinking about our problem set and how we'll go about doing it. But it's a cultural shift as much as anything.
So Tom, Amazon isn't part of the federal acquisition system, but you touch Amazon Government Services and C2S. Yes. How do you see Amazon's, I'll say, internal acquisition process and the models and to General Saltzman's point about the infrastructure and processes? How does that square with what you're seeing on your government customer side?
Yeah, I'll tell you, I think a lot about if I ever go back out into large systems integrator world, what I would do differently and what I would try to drive differently based on the experience that I've lived over the last couple of years at Amazon. I talked about our leadership principles previously. Number one is customer obsession. And the notion of customer obsession is fundamentally build stuff that your customers want to buy. So I think that's one thing that I would probably bring back into the federal contracting world is to focus a little bit less on specific acquisitions and focus more on developing capabilities that people are going to use. And I think the acquisitions would find a way to find the things that people want to buy.
Thank you. Interesting. So I've got a series of questions here related to training, and I'm going to try to paraphrase and combine a couple of them. So the human element is clearly important when we talk about time as a weapon. Do you have comments, first of all, since we're here at a DARPA conference, on how technology can help train time as a weapon, but then also for a lot of the things, whether it is that operational planning problem or even, I'll use my favorite term that gets overused in DoD, a DevOps mindset on the development and sustainment. There are a lot of concerns about how you train the workforce, and do we have the right workforce within DoD to support that kind of operations and sustainment mindset. So training for time as a weapon, technology to help train time, training to help provide time. Comments?
Yeah, I'll take a swing at that one. This is forefront of our mind in a lot of areas. I talked briefly about kind of the command and control training, but the technology piece is critical. One of the stories we heard as we were collecting information, and I'm pretty sure this was Wells Fargo story about how they see themselves as a software company that happens to do financial management, financial services. And the reason they think like that is because so much of their workforce has to be software engineers and software designers and coders in order to adequately account for the financial services that they provide. And so the question that imposes is, hey, are we attracting the right skills? Are we doing the right things to build a workforce that can compete and produce the results that we need as we start thinking of ourselves as competing in a more digital environment, a more digital age and security environment? And that's a hard question, especially when we all get asked, well, you're not going to get added a lot of people. We're not going to double the size. When I joined the Air Force, we were about 550,000. We're down to 320 now. We're not going back to 550. There's no plan for that. And we don't need to. We've taken advantage of too many other efficiencies. But do the people we have in the Air Force have the right skills? Are they the right training for the kinds of challenges that we're going to face? And I think the easy answer is not yet. The better question is, what are we doing to make sure that shifts a little so that we have the right kinds of resources in terms of human capital to answer the tough questions of the day? And that's exactly what our Air Education and Training Command has been asked to do, is force develop the type of airmen that we need to answer the questions that are going to be most prominent and most difficult in the next 10 to 15 years. And so we're actively pursuing that.
We hire a lot of former military at Amazon, and we have a program, it's called AI2. It's a 12-week program where we take people who are leaving military service, bring them into Amazon, and basically turn them into cloud engineers within 12 weeks. And I think there's no question that the aptitude and the mettle is there in the military. It's probably unfortunate for the military that we're doing that at the end of their military service as opposed to during their military service. So I guess my experience has been, if we can do this as they're departing the military, there's probably no reason why we can't be doing this during their military service.
So I'm going to read this question as is, and maybe combine it with a couple others. I'm going to read it as is because I'm not sure that I personally agree with this statement, but I'm going to read it as is to be provocative here. So the difference between Amazon and the military is that no one's trying to kill Amazon while it's trying to do its job. How do you use time as a weapon when the adversary is also trying to use time as a weapon? And I'll combine it with another question we got. How do you balance accelerating our own timelines with degrading the bad guy's timeline? So I guess first to Tom. So is no one trying to kill Amazon? Well, no one's kinetically shooting bullets at you.
I'll tell you a story. One of our data centers is actually at the end of a training range, a shooting range. And we did have a breach about 3 months ago. We had guys taking on shotgun fire and walking out to their trucks. So I'm not sure I would agree with that based on our experience. The reality is we're enabling technology for warfighters and the intelligence community as well. So, we talked a little bit about the cyber world, and I think most people recognize at this stage that the cyber element and the cyber domain is where an awful lot of warfare occurs as well. So I might take some umbrage with that statement, but I think I understand where they're coming from, but I think the modern battlefield includes the cyber domain.
What do you think about that, Dan? I mean, does that intensity of combat affect the ability to use time as a weapon, or does it actually accelerate it, or are there things you do to degrade the bad guys?
We often term it as a competitive environment, which I'm sure is what Amazon is working under as well. Maybe the stakes are different, and in that competitive environment, it's experience, and this is where technology can help us gain that experience. And we can't recreate all of the human dimension of battle at the small unit level in our training. We can't create all of the fear and human emotions in it, but we can create the uncertainty and the chaos. An example would be, very pedantic example, but if you take a new small unit, infantry unit in engagement with the enemy, they will have a bias for action. We build a bias for action in them in our training, and they will take action immediately. but you take a bit more experienced unit and they will know how to manipulate time, speed it up and slow it down. For instance, the first thing they'll do on contact is they'll stop and they'll talk to each other and say, where is the enemy and what is the character of the enemy? And then they will demonstrate a bias for action. And that difference comes only from the experience. You can't put that in the book, and you can't have the machine, no matter how good our AI is, do that for them. But it can give them the environment to build that tool themselves.
So this is an interesting question, and again, I'm going to combine it with a couple others here in interest of time. So the comment here, time has always been a weapon throughout history. We've always talked since the OODA loop or some variant of OODA loop, initiative, outflanking, whatever, throughout history. What's different now? And I guess tied to that, some other observations asking about question of time scale in terms of actually, are we talking hours, minutes, seconds, milliseconds? And is there a way to actually quantitatively measure the value of time? So I don't know if those are two different questions or if they relate, but in my mind they relate. So comments about why now?
Well, if you don't mind, time has always been a weapon, but it's a relative term, obviously. And the difference between months, days, hours, and minutes, seconds, and milliseconds has to be accounted for in the kind of systems you employ, the kind of defenses you put up, and almost every other aspect of the military endeavor. So, yes, time has always been a weapon, but the mistakes now can cost you issues in milliseconds. And I think that's one of our biggest fears is if we have one of the most powerful capabilities the world's ever seen in terms of power projection. But if we can't put those forces where they need to be in time to create a strategic advantage, it doesn't matter how powerful those forces are. And if through denial of space capabilities and cyber capabilities, we don't have the ability to put our forces where we want them, that's a strategic advantage for the wrong side of the equation. And some of those battles are going to occur in milliseconds. And so I just hate for us to start playing a game of chess from the position of check. And I feel like that's our starting point in some cases if we don't kind of correct the action.
At the ragged tactical edge, the difference we're seeing, we have typically historically considered tempo as a weapon. And the difference between tempo and time in our mind is that tempo is relative to the enemy. And how do you judge and measure using time as a weapon is based on initiative. Who controls the initiative of the event, who asserts their will. But what we've seen is a compression of abilities to the small unit levels, whereas before external support to our small units, ground, sea, or in the air, was difficult to come by, difficult to access, and we would measure that support in hours or days typically, and at the ragged edge, minutes, for external support. Now it's at their fingertips, and we measure it at the speed to press enter in milliseconds. And we have small unit leaders whose age hasn't changed, whose maturity and experience hasn't changed, but now they have access to all of these capabilities that we have continued to push down just by virtue of proliferation of technology. So we have to think about it in our younger ranks much quicker, and we have to give them the experience and tools to manipulate time, not just tempo, but time writ large.
That's an interesting set of comments, and it ties to a couple more questions we just received, and it also gets to something that Tom said that surprised me a little bit compared to the way I've been thinking about this problem in the past. And it's the balance between time, efficiency, and risk. So he made a very valid comment about you need to divorce some notion of efficiency to provision for time. But I've often been thinking about time as being something you could trade for provisioning. So I see an issue in today's approach, and this might be another reason of why now. If we can build a system that's so much more capable than anything we think the bad guys can throw at us, back to the requirements process. That it's going to be the best thing out there for 30 years. I don't have to go fast. But if I think we're close to parity, then I've got to be able to react more. If I have so many forces on the battlefield, there's no way the bad guy can outflank me. I don't have to worry as much about how fast I maneuver. So is there a linkage between time and efficiency on one set of axes, and then on the other, risk? Are you actually taking more risk to move fast, or is the agility and the adaptability that you're getting actually reducing risk? Maybe there's even a two-way door in there somewhere.
Yeah, that's a big question, man. No, it certainly makes sense. I mean, I think about just the brute force ability, especially of the cloud. If we talk about shaving 10 or 20 points of efficiency out of a problem, well, I can easily overcome that by throwing a lot more instances or hardware at a problem and doing things much faster. But the risk element is a different one, and there's a risk of not going fast enough. That's certainly something that we're concerned about. But there's also this notion of is there a risk of going too fast and maybe going through some one-way doors and not realizing that we've taken on too much too quickly.
We had a model that we built to address this a little bit, and it was on the vertical axis was quality of decisions, and then across the horizontal was time. And the initial thought was, if you have more time, you can make higher quality decisions. And so the question is, what's the slope look like, or what's the curve look like that you would draw? And then where's the optimal place to be on that curve, right? I mean, interesting. But what we found was, regardless of what you draw, whether it's a straight line, whether it's some sort of curve where you get diminishing returns as you get faster and faster, it's not about where you position yourself on the curve, because there may be good reasons to make high-quality, slow decisions. I don't know. Thermonuclear weapons comes to mind. And there may be where a fast decision now that may be low quality is the absolute right call, given the circumstances. So it's not about evaluating where do we want to be on this curve. What I would propose, it's about shifting the shape of that curve so you keep high-quality decisions as long as possible while you're diminishing the time it takes to make that. And so what is it that shifts that curve? And that's where it's training. That's where it's some tools to help you, more information faster at your disposal in a context that facilitates faster decision making. And so that was the idea that we had, was kind of how do you shift this curve in such a way, shift the shape of the curve to maintain high quality decisions made as rapidly as possible.
You have thoughts, Dan?
We view our contacts with adversaries, the beginning gambit of those, as an experiment in itself, and that the time is a factor of who learns quickest, because you can create the most invulnerable weapon you want. There's always an asymmetric vulnerability that you didn't think of, and history is full of the invulnerable weapons being taken out by David with the sling and his stone. We see this in the Proteus program very clearly that Dr. Paskowitz puts together, that it's a matter of giving the leader at whatever level the ability to weigh that risk and his options, and look at time versus resources together and put his judgment to it. We can iterate him through judgment as part of our training and education, but when he can see it very clearly and very quickly, he can adapt faster than his adversary in that phase of exploration of each other. We never, armies through history don't plan it right who their adversary is and what they look like. So we have to just recognize that it's a learning event.
So I think we are almost out of time, but I think I've got to ask this one last question here, because I think it does tie together all of your last comments, as well as being really provocative, and it brings out this theme of competition. So let's assume that, pick a bad guy, is having this same conference going on right now and talking about time as a weapon. And they're going to go use AI, and they're going to use a lot of automation. And maybe they don't even have that risk curve. Maybe they're more risk acceptant, whether it's attrition or even global destabilization. Where does that place us in a competition of time Do we get to a point where eventually we have to just hand everything over to the computer and AI and let the computer fight the computer and see who goes faster? Or are there places where that competition of time breaks? Thoughts?
That is provocative, and that speaks to that fence that I was trying to describe between what we can automate at machine speed and what we can't. Until DARPA invents the computer that accurately reflects the 7 basic emotions of humans and acts on them, we have to really look at the separation of what we decide to automate. You can't automate any of the basic emotions yet that's central. That's what we view warfare is, and it involves this interplay between threat of force and force, all of it fatal. So what we can separate out of that and automate, the computer is going to do faster than I'm going to be able to do, and it's going to stack tasks much faster. But we have to have a discipline to say this is still inherently a human endeavor. That may change with how computing goes. I don't track that too closely. But right now, the human emotion is unpredictable, and it's the central tenet of warfare. So really being disciplined about how we separate what we do at machine speed is important.
I think I'd add to that, let's remember what problems we're trying to solve now and how hard it is to solve those problems before we start adding AI into everything. I think there's a time and a place for that. But right now in the Air Operations Center, they're doing basic math on whiteboards that are building the plans, that are flying the planes. And we don't even have good spreadsheets to automate some of that. So, I think it's a worthwhile pursuit, especially academically, to start thinking about that, because we certainly don't want technology to be out in front of our thought on how we would use those things. But there is so much space for automation, machine learning, and some basic algorithms that you might qualify as low-end artificial intelligence, just to help us do what we're currently doing. And knowing how hard the acquisition process will fight us in fielding that in an operationally relevant timeline, that's what I want to focus all of our energy on, at least in the near term. And then have the academic discussion on Ender's Game and all that good stuff. So.
Yeah, I guess the one analogy that pops to mind is that I like to use the stock market as a leading indicator of maybe what's to come. And computers have been trading stocks for decades now, and to the best of my knowledge, none of them are really beating Warren Buffett or Jeff Bezos. So I think that over time, the AI tools will have a place. We'll understand kind of where they do well, but at the end of the day, the battle space will probably continue to morph and change such that we'll always need that human element.
So with that, we are out of time. So I want to thank a really awesome panel, and I also want to thank a great audience and some fantastic questions.